Alright, so we're gonna look through here on your Judges Final. So feel free to have one of these printed out, and we're just gonna kind of make our way through this quickly. Um, if you have any questions or things, you can probably just fast forward or rewind. Alright, so let's get started. Number one, explain in your own words the significance that Saul and his servant don't seem to even know the name of Saul. Okay, so explain in your own words the significance that Saul and his servant don't seem to even know the name of Samuel. So if you remember, we talked about that a little bit, where as Saul and his servant are looking for these donkeys, his servant mentions, well, I think there's a, guy here in this town who hears from the Lord, and they don't mention his name at all. Um, they definitely don't mention him in the context that we would think, this is Samuel. You have this idea that the whole nation knows who he is. But they just knew that there was someone there who could hear from the Lord, right? And so the significance of that is that in this period of Judges, it's not quite like the monarchy where everybody knows about the kings and that kind of stuff. It's a very rural and divided society, where you could have things going on with one or two tribes on one end of the country, and then a couple other tribes on the other end of the country have their own struggles, and they don't really know much about each other. And so it's not nearly as unified as we saw under Moses and Joshua, or as we see later under the monarchies of David and Solomon. Okay. Number two, according to tradition, who was the author of the book of Judges? So Samuel. Number three, the book of Judges must have been written after what point? Well, throughout the book there's a couple references that say, at this point, people were doing this because there was not yet a king in Israel, right? So when you hear somebody in the book of Judges say, well, they're doing this because there was not yet a king in Israel, then that seems to imply then that it was written after one of the kings had been instituted, so Saul being the first king. And so if Samuel was the one that wrote this, he must have began compiling this after Saul's inauguration, at the bare minimum, Okay. Let me see here. Number four. What other book of the Bible was originally part of the book of Judges? That would be Ruth. Number five. Who was the Levite priest who was captured by the tribe of Dan and became their private priest? So if you remember, there's that whole story towards the back of the book of Judges, where the tribe of Dan goes through and ransacks Micah's house on the way north to establish themselves in the northern territories. And on the way up, they take his priest that he had set up there, and so that was Moses' grandson Jonathan. Moses' grandson Jonathan. Okay. All right. Number 6. What was Othniel's wife asking Caleb for? So, Othniel's wife, right, which was Caleb's daughter, was asking for an area of water in the desert, right? So the land that he had offered to give them, it was a good city, but it was also on the edge of the wilderness there. And so she's saying, hey, listen, if you're going to put us over here, then we need to get some kind of a spring, some kind of source of natural water. And so that's what she was asking him for. Number 7, there are many references in the book of Judges to the city of palms. So you may not remember this. We didn't talk about it a whole lot. But the city of palms is Jericho. And so throughout the book of Judges, you'll hear that reference to the city of palms, that area there. And so obviously the actual city itself of Jericho had been destroyed. But that region and the surrounding regions around Jericho was still somewhat inhabited. And so that became known as the city of palms. Number 8. Explain in your own words the significance of Caleb's genealogy. So remember we talked about how Caleb, the Bible refers to him as a Kenizzite, which it could mean that one of his descendants' name was Kenaz, and so they've called him a Kenizzite. Or in Genesis, it says that there's an entire tribe of Kenizzites that lived in the Promised Land, and it was one of the nations that God promised Abraham that he would drive out. And so the significance then would be that Caleb, like Joshua, would have been partly Gentile, right? So Joshua was Egyptian and Jewish, right? And then Caleb then would have been, we know he was from the tribe of Judah, but apparently his father was a Kenizzite, and which is why there's so many references in Joshua and Judges where it says things like, because of Caleb's faithfulness he was given an inheritance among the children of Israel, and so when you hear that, if you didn't realize that one of his parents was not an Israelite, you wouldn't understand the significance of why it's saying he was also given an inheritance because of his faithfulness, right? And so that's kind of the significance there, is that Caleb might have been half Gentile as well, and so the two spies that were faithful, neither one of them were pure Hebrew. Okay. All right. Number 9. Explain the significance of the wording of Judges 1:31 through 33. Alright, so what I'm looking for in this is the passage. Let me pull this up here. Where it's talking about the different inheritances and the different tribes and things. And in there, the wording is that it says that the Asherites and the tribe of Naphtali were living among the Canaanites, right? And so the idea is that in all the other places it says that the Canaanites, or whatever these foreign tribes were living among the Israelites. But when it gets to these northern tribes, which we know they never did take a whole bunch of their territory, it says that they were living among the Canaanites. And so it's the reverse order, which tends to imply that those northern tribes were the minority and that they never did take a majority position in their inheritance. All right. Number 10, explain in your own words why God allowed the enemies of Israel to remain in the Promised Land. So this is one that I'd like you to do on your own. We talked about this quite a bit, about what is going on here. Why did the Lord allow... it's even in Judges chapter 2, the Lord explains it, why he is allowing these enemies to remain. Right? Okay. Number 11. Joshua was buried at Timnath-Heres, meaning land of the sun. Why is this significant? I think we went over this in class. If we didn't, then hey, this might just be something interesting and new for you. But Timnath-Heres means land of the sun. And you'll find it other places as Timnath-Serah, but it's just the last words are transposed or backwards. S-E-R-E-H. So but Timnath-Heres and Timnath-Serah, it's the same thing. Just for some reason, every once in a while they switch the wording of that last word there. But it both means land of the sun, right? And this is right next to Ajalon. And Ajalon is where the sun stood still. So this is that same valley, same area there. And this is where Joshua was buried. And so it's called the land of the sun. And so it's possible that got its name the land of the sun, not because of the sun itself per se, but because that's where the miracle was when the sun stood still. And it's interesting that that's where Joshua chose to be buried. Right? Okay. Number 12. The name Philistine comes from the Hebrew word for what? We believe it's the Hebrew word for invader. Invader. Which fits well with what we know about them to have been a sea people that has kind of come down and trying to reestablish themselves in the land of Canaan from wherever they came from, presumably from the north. Alright, number 13. Jeremiah 47:4 calls the Philistines the people of Caphtor. Why is this significant? It's kind of an interesting thing here because we don't see a whole lot of references to Philistines in other literature, right? In other secular sources from other countries, although they seem to have played a very predominant role in biblical history. And so it's possible that Jeremiah there is referring to them as the people of Caphtor, right? And so the theory then would be that is why you don't get the name Philistine, that Philistine was a Hebrew kind of moniker that they gave them, right? A Hebrew name. That's what the Hebrews are calling them. If it means invader, then it's almost like saying these are the people of the invasion. It's not necessarily what the Philistines called themselves, right? The Philistines might have viewed themselves as the people of Caphtor or something like that, and the Hebrews are calling them the invaders. But so anyways, the reason that's significant is because that could be why we don't get that term Philistine showing up in other countries' literature, which you would have expected, considering they seem to be such a dominant country during biblical times. So it could be this other name, the people of Caphtor, is where we need to look for other references to the Philistines. Right? Okay, number 14. Explain the significance of the Septuagint translation of the name Philistine. The reason that that's important is because there's a group called, in most English Bibles, the Philistines during Abraham's time, and then there's a group of Philistines starting with Samson all the way through into David's time that seem to be very different. Goliath seems much different than some of the other Philistine leaders that dealt with Abraham, and just the whole tenor of the Philistine camp seems different during Abraham's stay than it does really in David's stay. And so in the Septuagint, they give them different names. And so that Greek translation of the Hebrew Bible from 300 or 400 years before Christ describes these as two different groups, although they get the name Philistine for both of them in most English Bibles. So it just goes to show you that from our earliest translations, they did not consider those to be the same groups of people from Abraham's time and then the group there that David is dealing with. All right? Okay. Number 15. What is significant about the dialogue that takes place at different times between the Israelites and the Philistines? Well, what I'm looking for here is the fact that they never seem to have language problems. They seem to be able to converse back and forth very easily. And so, it kind of makes you wonder, if these people just showed up, they're all speaking the same language here, which is kind of an interesting thing. All right. Number 16. Judges 3, verse 7, describes the attack of Cushan Rishaim from Shinar, which is Babylon. And the name Cush makes us believe he is a descendant of whom? So Shinar is Babylon, we know that, and this guy's name is Cushan, right? Well, Nimrod's father was Cush, and Nimrod was the king. In Nimrod's day, he was the king of Shinar, right? And his father's name was Cush. And so this guy's name is Cushan, makes us believe that he was somehow descended from that line of Babylonian kings that traces itself back to Nimrod in the Tower of Babel. Number 17, explain the reasoning behind the close association of the tribe of Benjamin with the tribe of Ephraim. So if you remember, we talked about this, that both of those tribes and Manasseh were descended from Rachel, right? And so Manasseh being quite a bit on the other side of the Jordan, with Gad and Gilead and Reuben and those areas over there, they tended to develop more of a relationship with them, because they were both all on the east side of the Jordan. But over there on the west side of the Jordan, Ephraim and Benjamin were right next to each other. And because they were both descended from Rachel, you can kind of see close kind of interaction between them in these early years. Number 18, explain how there could be a king Jabin of the Canaanites defeated at Hazor in Joshua 11 and in Judges 4. So the most likely thing here is it's twofold. It's a twofold answer. One is that Jabin was not the guy's personal name, it was their title of their king, right? Just like Pharaoh was not Pharaoh's actual name. It was his title. So Jabin then is probably the title of the king of the Canaanites, right? And then the second thing is that even though Joshua devoted Hazor to the ban and destroyed that area, the northern tribes never drove out the Canaanites. In fact, remember the earlier question where it said that these northern tribes were living among the Canaanites as opposed to the Canaanites living among them. And so it's entirely possible that even though Joshua won that battle up there, because the northern tribes never reasserted a dominant influence there, that the Canaanites just rebuilt or reestablished something in that general area. And by the time of Judges, they're back as a force again. All right, number 19. In the battle under Deborah's leadership, right, so this battle with Sisera, with Deborah and Barak, what method did the Lord use to hinder the attack of Sisera? Well, if you remember, they had all kinds of chariots, and that's what was an intimidating weapon in the old days, was the chariot. You know, it's like the modern day stealth fighter or tank, right? And so they were very dominant in the fields, in the valleys, which is probably why the Jezreel Valley became such a hot spot, because many of these foreign nations wanted to fight their battles in a place where their chariots could be effective. And so that Jezreel Valley, the Valley of Armageddon, so many battles were fought there, and a lot of it's because it was very easy for the chariots to maneuver there. Except the Lord causes the Kishon River to overflow its bounds and becomes a muddy, swampy area, which renders the chariot part of their army useless, right? And it sends them into a tailspin, and then that's when Deborah and Barak are able to chase them down and defeat their armies. All right, so the answer to 19 is that he overflooded the Kishon River to make it so that the chariots could not be driven in the valley. Okay. All right, and then number 20, along those same lines, explain in your own words the significance of the Jezreel Valley. Right. So what I'm after here, I'm going to leave it up to you, but something to the effect of talking about the different battles that were there, and then Revelation. You could jump on that too if you wanted, on how this is the Valley of Armageddon. Jesus grew up in Nazareth, which is here in the same spot. I mean, so there's a lot of things you could talk about. Many of the battles with the Philistines and Canaanites, Midianites, many of these different battles all took place in this one spot. So it's a very important biblical site, right? Number 21. What is significant about the fact that Gideon was sifting wheat when God called him? So I think the significant thing of that is that, like several other of these biblical heroes, that what they're doing at the time that God visits them is a foreshadow of what they're going to do in their calling, right? And so God finds him sifting wheat, and he is the notorious battle leader that God used to sift the army down to just 300 people, right? Just like David was tending sheep, and God used him to shepherd Israel. Saul was chasing donkeys, and the main thing about his ministry, his life, was that he chased David around his whole life. Never did catch him, just like he never did catch the donkeys that he was chasing. It's kind of interesting to go back in and look at that. But with Gideon, he's sifting wheat, and God calls him to sift out the army, which is kind of neat, right? Number 22. What tribe was often upset that they were not included in the battle plans, right? So what tribe was often... If you remember, this is Ephraim, right? The Ephraimites on several occasions were upset because they were not included. Probably this has to do with the fact that they considered themselves to be a dominant or lead tribe because Joshua came from their tribe. So when they entered the promised land, they were the front-running tribe. They were the head tribe, so to speak, because Joshua was the leader and he was from Ephraim. And so it's possible that they tried to hold on to that or carried with them that that sense of position and priority that after a while the other tribes just didn't recognize anymore. Right? Okay. Number 23. What significant fact did we learn from the pictures taken at the spring where Gideon separated his men down to 300? It's that the place where the enemy was camped was right there. I mean, just an hour's walk from where they were at. I mean, they could see it. It's just the other side of the field is where the enemy was camped, and so that's kind of an interesting thing when you look at, because in the narrative, when you're reading that he's at this spring and separating stuff, you don't understand that they're right next to the enemy camp at this point when he sends everyone home. Right? They would have seen how significant the army was as he's sending all of these people home. All right, number 24. What is significant about the fact that Abimelech receives his authority at the oak with a pillar at Shechem? Well, if you remember, we talked about this is where Joshua brought everyone to Shechem to renew the covenant. And Joshua says, "As for me and my house, we will serve the Lord." And it's here then that Abimelech sets up his leadership and a return to Baal worship. Right? So the very place where Israel declared before God and set up a memorial before God that they would serve the Lord only is the same place where Abimelech chooses to be installed as their new leader and start bringing back Baal worship. Right? Okay. 25. What other judge most likely ruled concurrently with Jephthah? That would be Samson. Samson and Jephthah. Jephthah was dealing with the Ammonites on the east, and Samson would have been dealing with the Philistines on the west. 26. What is significant about the fact that Samuel spent so much time writing about the failure of Samson and his Nazirite vow? Well, the idea is that Samuel himself was a Nazirite who was not allowed to cut his hair just like Samson. And so it's kind of interesting to think that perhaps that's why that story becomes the centerpiece in many ways of the book of Judges. It's the longest story. It's the most detailed story. Is the happenings here with the life of Samson. And so it's entirely possible that this held extra meaning for Samuel, the author of the book, because he was also someone who had his spiritual connection with the Lord, where his hair and the not ever shaving and cutting his hair was part of it too, right? Almost makes you wonder if anybody knew that about Samuel. That just like nobody knew that was a source of Samson's strength. Did they know this about Samuel as well? 27. What is significant about Judges 13:5 for the purposes of Samson? That's an interesting phrase because we often give Samson a hard time for not fulfilling his calling, right? That he never did defeat the Philistines. But the interesting thing is that God's calling, when you read what it actually says that Samson will begin the deliverance from the Philistines. He never says that Samson will deliver his people from the Philistines. He says he will begin the deliverance. The actual finality of it was David and Solomon's time, primarily David, and then the finishing touches were established by Solomon. Okay. All right, and then last one, number 28. What important fact did we discover by looking at the picture of Samson's childhood home? So what I want here is something to the effect that Timnah and the valley, Timnah, where he tried to get the first wife, and he went down and had the party, and on the way down he had found a lion, and it had honey in it, and he gives the people the riddle, but they ended up, getting his wife to tell him what the answer was. So he sets foxes' tails on fire through their fields. That's Timnah. Then Sorek is where Delilah was, and then Zorah is where Samson grew up. And so all three of them are in the same picture. They're in it's the same valley. It's just different sides of the same valley. And so that explains why Samson was so prone to go down to these Philistine camps, because he lived on the same hill basically that they did. And so that was their world, and it also shows, that there probably was quite a bit of interaction between these two nations. They weren't supposed to be enemies, but here they are camped on the same hill, basically, the same valley, and they're sharing it somewhat peacefully. There's no war going on. Samson killed some of them when they tried to kill him. But other than that, there is no war. Samson's walking freely among their city, picking up wives and partying with them, right? So just kind of helps to shed a little light on the situation of that culture at the time. Okay. All right, so that's your finals review. If you go through these, you should have no problem on your final.